Okay, so this discussion, we're going to look at just some exercise technique basics. So we're just going to be looking at some general principles that we look at regarding exercise technique in regards to strength training and resistance training. And then we're going to get into, like I said, after this, we're going to do some basic stuff on some items related to resistance training that are important. This section goes along with chapter 15 in your textbook. All right, so here we're going to be looking at different types of hand grips. So what I'm going to do is I'll kind of go through these grips with you and kind of show you them, talk about how they're used. You have a pronated grip, which as you can see right here, both hands palm down. You have a supinated grip, which is both hands palms up. You have a neutral grip, which is not pictured here. Okay, so a neutral grip is basically when the palms face each other. So because the picture here is illustrating a straight bar, you can't take a neutral grip on a straight bar. So usually you would need some type of specialty bar, or you commonly see this in like a cable row exercise when you have the kind of the double D handle sort of, where you kind of hold on to that and your palms face each other. That would be a neutral grip. So that is not pictured here. The alternating grip is right here, where you see one palm up and one palm down. And then you have the hook grip, which is where, if you look here where the thumb is placed, so the thumb here is kind of tucked underneath the other fingers, okay? So that would be your hook grip. So the hook grip and the alternating grip are usually used when you're worried about your grip being a limiting factor. The alternating grip is very commonly used for the deadlift. It's also used as a spotting grip, and we're going to talk about spotting and why you would want to use an alternating grip to spot. The hook grip, some individuals do use the hook grip to deadlift if they don't want to possibly put any torsional forces through their back when they deadlift. They'll use a hook grip. It's also very commonly used with Olympic lifts. Another way we look at grips is how the thumb, whether or not the thumb wraps around the bar or not. And the thumb, in the case of when you do not wrap your thumb around the bar, that is called an open or a false grip. If you wrap the thumb around the bar, you have a closed grip. So all of what you're seeing here in the picture, you're seeing all closed grips, okay, because the thumb's wrapping around the bar. If you were not to wrap your thumb around the bar, that would be considered an open grip. You use the open grip very limitedly, or at least you should, for safety purposes. For instance, like some people will bench press with an open grip, and that's kind of a dangerous thing to do because the bar could slide out. There's actually documented incidences of open grip bench pressing where individuals are dropping barbells on their throat and chest, which is not a good thing to do. So there are a couple instances where an open or false grip can be used. Some individuals do like to use an open grip when they're back squatting, because especially if they have some shoulder tightness. They also will use it for sometimes just strict overhead pressing with a barbell. Not as much of a risk there, but again, you still do have to be concerned. And again, sometimes people just do it because they feel their shoulders kind of open up and get a little bit more mobility out of it. Grip widths are basically just going to basically how wide of a grip you're taking on the bar, and there's three common grip widths, and I'll show this on the next slide what this looks at. There's the common grip, a wide grip, and a narrow grip. To a degree, how wide the grip is or how it gets classified is kind of based on how the person is built. We'll kind of I'll talk about on the next slide when I show you the bar, kind of how some people may position themselves slightly differently with this. But again, if you get, individuals of different builds, like for instance, a lot of basketball athletes, for instance, tend to be very long-limbed and have kind of shorter, more narrow torsos. That could affect how your grip is. But there's some common basic areas where you would look at for these. So we'll take a look at that on the illustration coming up. So here you have pictured kind of a narrow, or what we'd call a close grip, a common grip, and a wide grip. So many times, for instance, when you look at most barbells, so if you kind of see this little like rough part of the barbell, that's what's called the knurling. A lot of times there's rings. They don't have the rings on here, but usually what I would tell people is, a narrow grip is your at least one finger on or right next to the smooth part of the bar. The common grip could kind of vary for people, but you kind of see it's in between here. So usually this is inside what would be the rings. So normally like the rings are usually like out here on the barbell where you see the pointer. So the common grip is usually in there around shoulder width, maybe a little wider than shoulder width. Obviously the wide grip would be outside that. The other kind of grips to note that your book talks about, and they can be related back to this, are the clean grip and the snatch grip. So they're the grips used for the Olympic lifts. We are going to talk a little bit about the Olympic lifts in class. But the clean grip is obviously a slightly closer grip. Most people when they take their clean grip, it's a little closer to the it's a little closer to like between a common and a narrow grip. The snatch grip is much wider because if you and we're not going to discuss it per se in this discussion, but if you can see for yourself, if you look at the snatch exercise in the book, it is a much wider grip. They use two types of measurements to determine the snatch grip. One is the fist to opposite shoulder, and the other is the elbow to elbow method. So those are two methods used to measure that. The clean grip is going to be, again, a little bit closer. Both of them are going to be pronated closed grips, and again, many times they'll use the hook grip to kind of assist with those particular lifts when they're performing them. So stable body and limb positioning is very important. Again, we want to make sure that for all exercise, again, these are just some very general recommendations for things, but again, important, particularly for your big multi-joint exercises. Again, stable body position enables the athlete to maintain proper body alignment. Again, that's going to put appropriate stress on the muscles and joints and just provide kind of a safer posture, safer positioning for the actual exercise. And both free weight and machine exercises require a stable position. So, free weight exercises, obviously there's a major importance for it, but even for machine exercises, you want to make sure that, your joints are all aligned and that you're in a good position so that you still get the necessary effect out of those individual exercises. So continuing on with this idea of stable body and limb positioning, so the textbook talks about 5 points of body contact, okay? So again, you're going to be looking here at 5 points of body contact. We'll talk about situations where obviously, there's all sorts of exercises. There's exercises where you're standing, sitting, so on and so forth. But this just looks at the 5-point body contact, and then I'll discuss some other things. So when you're doing a seated or supine exercise, you want the head placed firmly on the bench or back of pad. You want the shoulders and upper back placed firmly and evenly on the bench or back pad. So particularly a good example with this is with the bench press. Many people fail to get their shoulders really stabilized on the bench press. It ends up limiting their the weight that they can use, and it also kind of hurts their stability at their shoulders. So, and that's where a lot of shoulder problems with the bench press tend to come in. Buttocks evenly placed on the bench or seat. Right foot flat on the floor, left foot flat on the floor. So that's kind of like your basic 5 points of contact when you're discussing like a seated or supine exercise. Now, when you talk about standing exercises, typically any standing exercise, the feet are usually going to be positioned wider than hip width. Okay, so usually you're going to be closer to shoulder width, maybe in some instances even going wider than that. So it really does depend on the exercise, but most of the exercises that you're going to do are going to be wider than hip width. Heels and balls of feet should be in contact with the floor. So that's really, when you talk about a standing exercise, what you're looking at with there. And then here you see the 5 important points when you're seated or supine. General recommendations for range of motion and speed. Again, there can be some exceptions to these rules, but again, we're talking basic exercise technique for now. We'll discuss, some exceptions that do come into play with this. For the most part, you're going to get most of your maximum benefit from using full range of motion. Okay, so, and you're going to go and you're going to see certain exercise variations done at partial ranges of motion. There can be a time and place for that, but for the most part, most people should use full range of motion. And the benefit to that is it's also going to help not only maintain, but it could even improve your flexibility. There's some evidence out there showing that just doing your resistance training exercises through a full range of motion are going to kind of help and assist with improving that flexibility, probably more so even than stretching. So that's one important thing to look at. Another thing is we kind of look at the exercises being done in slow, controlled movements. Again, there are quick movements that are appropriate. The power exercises, for instance, or any exercise could really be a power exercise. When your textbook and a lot of the lecture material refers to power exercises, they're usually referring to the Olympic lifts. Those obviously have to be performed fast. Really, any exercise can be done for power if done fast, but even when you do an exercise fast, there should be a degree of control to it, okay? But again, doing most of your exercises through slow, full range of motion is going to allow the exercise to be performed safely. And again, kind of, just from a joint health perspective, range of motion, it's going to be a benefit. Okay, looking at breathing considerations. Now, when we're talking about breathing considerations, we're going to be looking at how you're going to use your breath. If you are going to breathe during the repetition, there is something called the Valsalva maneuver, which we're going to talk about as well, which in the case of certain lifts, individuals will use to kind of further help with stability. But basically, when you're talking about breathing, so the sticking point of the lift, so usually where individuals will fail or where the most struggle will occur, is called the sticking point. And that occurs usually in most exercises after the transition from the eccentric to the concentric phase. So the eccentric phase is the lowering portion of the lift where the muscles are lengthening. They're contracting, but they're lengthening. And then obviously the lifting phase is the concentric phase where the muscles are going to shorten. So if we're talking the bench press, for instance, you're taking the weight out, you lower the weight, that's the eccentric phase. The active musculature is contracting, but they're contracting through a lengthening contraction. You come down, you touch, slight pause before you lift. That's going to translate into the concentric phase, okay? Right in that transition is where the sticking point's going to occur. Now, what you typically are going to instruct, particularly for beginners, individuals who are doing multiple repetitions, is to exhale through the sticking point. And you want to inhale during the less stressful phase of the repetition, which is going to be the eccentric phase. So you're going to breathe in during the eccentric, breathe out during the concentric, particularly through the sticking point, making sure not to lose your stability. So you don't obviously just want to breathe out and let all your air out. But you want to make sure that you're letting that air out, particularly when you're doing a multiple repetition. Next, what we're going to do is talk about the Valsalva maneuver and how that could be used, particularly during a lower repetition or heavier movement, and how that'll maintain stability. So the Valsalva maneuver, which is basically that kind of bearing down, if you will, basically trying to you're basically breathing against the closed glottis and you're going to be combining that with basically making the abdomen more rigid, okay? This is really going to be only for more experienced, well-trained athletes, and you really should only be using this during a structural exercise, or basically an exercise that's going to put stress on the vertebral column or your spine, okay? So for instance, you don't have the Valsalva maneuver if you're doing like a seated knee extension, okay? That's not a structural exercise. This would be something you would use during a squat, a deadlift, you know, those types of exercises where the vertebral column is going to be stressed, and you're really going to be doing this to help align and maintain proper vertebral alignment. It's the idea there. You're basically going to be expiring against a closed glottis, which will then help to further create rigidity, particularly in the torso, okay? So basically, you're basically allowing yourself to brace your abdomen harder when you do this, okay? And again, the idea here is it's going to help to maintain that sort of neutral spine, and it's going to further help to provide stability, okay? Typically, again, now the concern here is you do have to be aware there are some potential drawbacks to this. Obviously, dizziness, disorientation, excessively high blood pressure could happen with this. Individuals could black out. Breath holding should only be done very transient. It should only be done for about 1 to 2 seconds at most, typically. Even a well-trained person could still have some issues with breath holding. I personally have had an injury as a result of this when I did a Valsalva maneuver for too long. I experienced a pneumothorax or a collapsed lung because of that. So that's something that you definitely don't want to do. Really, this is going to be something you're going to do typically when somebody's going to do a 1 repetition max. I would say I would not breath hold for more than a 3 rep max at most, and even that's getting kind of long to do. You're probably going to want to even at some point still take a breath with that. But again, you don't want to maintain a really hard, strong Valsalva for a long period of time. Again, primarily because of the issues that I brought up. Okay, weight belts. So again, weight belts are something, they're a tool that can be used. There's nothing wrong with using weight belts. Again, they should be performed when exercises can potentially place stress on the lower back, and really should only be used in sets that involve near maximal or maximal loads, okay? So again, a weight belt can be utilized very appropriately. Again, when you use a weight belt, so a lot of people use weight belts the wrong way. A weight belt shouldn't be put on just super snug and cinched against your waist. You should actually be able to brace against the belt. That's really what a belt is used for. So a belt isn't getting used to support your back per se. It's actually helping to further support the natural brace that you would do with your abdomen. So you should really be bracing your abdomen out against the belt when you utilize it. And again, in these situations, using a belt is appropriate. You don't need a belt. If an exercise doesn't stress the low back, or if it involves light loads, you don't need a belt. In those instances, you could just go without a belt. You can still do your abdominal bracing technique, which is the technique that's going to help stabilize your spine. But ideally, you're not going to use belts in those circumstances. Okay, so looking at spotting free weight exercises. So this is, again, a big safety thing. You want to make sure that appropriate spotting could basically get performed. So again, types of exercises, again, time you have a bar moving over the head. So these are instances where a spotter should be getting used. Again, you're going to be seeing this with free weight exercises. A bar is moving over the head, bar positioned on the back, bar racked on the front of the shoulders, bar passing over the face, okay? So anytime you're doing an exercise where in any of these situations could be the case, you're going to want to be spotting. You are not going to spot the power exercises, and again, as I said, the book is basically referring to the Olympic lifts with this. So with the Olympic lifts, you will not spot the Olympic lifts. the idea with the Olympic lifts for safety purposes, what you essentially want to do, okay? So this is essentially how you basically want to teach your athletes how to miss with those exercises. So if they are going to miss, they need to learn how to, because you can't spot those exercises. You can't spot a clean or a snatch, okay? So basically you want to essentially teach them if they're going to miss, how they're supposed to miss, okay? So here's how you teach them how to miss. If they're doing an exercise, if they're doing one of the power or Olympic lifts, if they're going to miss the exercise in front of their body, okay, in other words, they're going to lose control or not be able to complete the lift, they are to push the weight forward and they are to move backwards, okay? So for instance, if they're going to do a clean, and I'm going to show you guys a clean in class, but if you want to look ahead now, you can kind of see how that gets done. They're somehow going to miss with that. They're to let the weight go in front of them. They move back. If they are going to miss something overhead, they're supposed to drop the weight behind them and move forward, okay? So in the case of a snatch lift, if they go and put the bar overhead and they get unsteady or they feel like they're not going to be able to come out of it out of the bottom, they're supposed to let it go behind them and move forward, okay? So that's essentially how they're going to miss with those exercises. In all the other lifts, you're going to make sure that you're going to be spotting the exercises, and we're going to talk about some basics as it relates to spotting. Okay, so anytime you're talking about overhead exercises and those with the bar on the back or front of the shoulders, okay? So first of all, if possible, perform any exercise you can in a power rack. So the power rack has automatic safety bars that can be set. So even with a spotter, it's usually a good idea to have that because, again, that could just further help to support the exercises. Again, out of the rack exercises, you got to be careful with. So some exercises you may not be able to do, like a forward step lunge or a step up where you may still be assisting them. You got to really be weary of those and make sure that you have appropriate spotting for that. And again, exercises should only be executed with well-trained, skilled athletes and spotted by experienced professionals. So you want to make sure that you have, appropriate spotting getting done with those exercises and make sure that appropriate technique has already been taught and instructed on. Okay, spotting over the face exercises. So again, probably the most commonly thing you would see with this would be a bench press, okay? So the over the face exercises, the spotter should grasp the bar with an alternating grip narrower than the athlete's grip. And again, that's how they should basically be spotting. So ideally with like a bench press where the bar is going to move in a straight line, you want to spot with an alternating grip. That's just going to make your grip be stronger so it doesn't slip out of your hands when you're trying to spot the lift. Now, in some exercises, if the bar has a curved trajectory, so obviously in a bench press, the bar for the most part moves in a straight line. Some people, the way they're built, they may have a slight curve in the bar, but for the most part, it's rather straight. If you have a really curved trajectory, like a line, like they're giving two good examples here, a lying tricep extension or a barbell pullover, the spotter should use an alternating grip to pick up the bar and return it to the floor, but they should use a supinated grip to spot the bar. So to spot the bar when it's moving in a curved trajectory, they should use a supinated grip, only because the bar is kind of moving in that curved pattern. With an alternating grip, it's going to be harder to grab it if something happens. So in the case when the bar is moving through a very curved path, you're going to want to use a supinated grip, okay? So again, think lying tricep extension, the barbell pullover exercise. Again, if you're not familiar with those, you can see pictures of them and see what they mean. I'll bring some of this stuff back up in class, but that's the type of grip you're going to use. But for if the bar is moving in a more straight line, like what you would typically see in most of your bench press variations, in those cases, you're going to use an alternating grip. So on the next slide, we're going to look at dumbbell spotting. So there are some instances where you're going to spot the dumbbell, and I'm going to show you kind of where the spotting for the dumbbells are going to take place. So here's your dumbbell spotting, okay? So this, what we're looking at here is, so if you're going to spot a dumbbell exercise, you want to spot at the wrist. So B is the correct position. So you want to spot at the wrist. You don't want to spot at the elbows, okay? Because essentially what could happen, and a lot of people still spot this way with dumbbell exercises. So with dumbbell pressing exercises, you don't want to spot at the elbows. If she fails and she gets kind of loose at her upper arm, she's going to get movement here and she could still end up getting hurt. So you want to spot at the wrist because you're going to have greater control. So the correct spotting position, if you're going to spot somebody with dumbbells, you want to make sure you're up at the wrist and not at the elbows. Okay, so that's an important point when you're looking at spotting for dumbbell exercises. Okay, so a couple other important points about spotting free weight exercises. Again, look at the number of spotters. So there's a couple things that kind of will determine that. You want to determine it by the load. So obviously, if you're talking somebody who's squatting a lot of weight, if you've ever watched like a powerlifting meet, they have multiple spotters, okay? So you want to look at the load, you want to look at the experience and ability of the athlete, the spotters, and the physical strength of the spotters. So, if you're a pretty strong person, the person spotting you doesn't necessarily have to be as strong as you, but they should be pretty close, okay? So you want to make sure that you have that. You also want to make sure that, in many instances, if you're going to add, more, if there's going to be, again, real heavy lift, how you want to actually, how many spotters you want to have is going to be really important. Communication between a spotter and a lifter, you want to make sure that you discuss how many repetitions you want to use, how to use a lift off, because many times if there's miscommunication, it could kind of screw up the lifter's sort of stability. So they're going to want to make sure that, again, communicate when you want the lift off to occur, if you want to lift off, how many repetitions you're looking to do so that the spotter kind of knows how you're basically going to complete the lift, and then any timing and spotting assistance. So, let them know, hey, I'm trying for 3, the third might be hard. I'll let you know if you have to take it. So a lot of that is going to be kind of really important when you're kind of doing that. So when we talk about some specific exercises, we'll talk a little bit about in class for some exercises how many spotters you would ideally have, or if you have multiple spotters, kind of how they should be positioned. And these are your learning outcomes, or what would basically be your summary. Again, we'll kind of touch on some other minor points in class as it relates to particular exercises, but for the most part, you have all of your basics regarding technique and spotting through this discussion.